Hello guys, and thank you for joining me in this video. Today I wanted to kind of bring together what I was talking about in previous video in regards to schema therapy and related concepts. I haven't been able to go deeply enough to bring all elements of schema therapy into what I was trying to present, but I was hoping to give like an overview or rather a description of the process that we go through if we are under the influence of the schema, for example. So I was focused on more practical elements, or the elements that we are all might be able to perceive if we put enough work into building self-awareness skills. So in this video I wanted to kind of, as I said, bring together what I was talking about, but also perhaps offer some practical tips on undoing basically the damage that potentially our schemas have done to us, so that in a way we can live more functional life and more authentic life, obviously, because being strongly influenced by our schemas and how we do things, how we perceive things, how we interpret our experiences will cause us to not be as authentic as we might be, as we could be, if we weren't under the influence of the schemas. So basically the process is quite simple. The process of what happens if we are strongly influenced by our schemas. Well, when a need arises, our schema gets triggered basically. It's going to produce some stress, some anxiety, because when we are unable to meet our needs, we're going to feel frustrated, even if we are not fully aware of this process, or if we are simply unconscious of what's going on internally. This stressful response is going to activate our coping style. So in this context, we can see the schema acting as a lens or as a mean of interpreting our experiences, as well as basically providing us with a knowledge on how we should act on this impulse, how we should act in regard to our need, in regard to what we perceive that we need in that particular situation or generally. So how we cope with this stressful response, how we cope with this response will determine our action. So for example, we might surrender to our schema, which will cause us to escalate in a way the schema to a point where it basically runs our life in a way. We might also avoid our schema, so we're going to use different behaviors. So we're going to use behaviors that are enabling us to escape from the influence of the schema. However, the very behaviors demonstrate that we are still kind of under the influence of that schema. And we might also try to overcompensate some sort of lack that we perceive. So we'll work hard to deny our schema, to do something that is in complete opposition to the schema that we might be having. So to use a practical example, let's say we have an unmet need for autonomy and competence. And for example, I might have a very strong schema related to dependence or simply feeling incompetent. So what happens is that instead of meeting my need for competence, for being autonomous, I'm going to believe what the schema shows me, which is basically that I'm incompetent and I'm unable to meet this need. I'm unable to be competent. I'm unable to be autonomous, and simply that I'm a sort of person that I need help, right? So that's what the schema tells me. That's the lens that I'm having on myself and on other people and on my experiences. Whereas there is no perception of my actual need in that case, because I can't see my need, because I see my schema. I see how my situation is in regards to that schema, which is actually coming from our past experiences and probably very negative experiences around meeting our needs. So what happens is that instead of having beliefs surrounding my competence framed in a positive way, so that, okay, with enough work, I can achieve this and this, right? Or I'm capable of learning, I'm capable of gaining new experiences and so on and forth. Instead of having all these positive beliefs, or at least encouraging beliefs and realistic beliefs. That's the most important thing, that our beliefs should be realistic in this context. I'm having beliefs in regards to my schema. That's what that schema is producing. That's the lenses that I'm using to interpret my experience. And because our need goes unmet, and because our schemas are associated with negative experiences, that's gonna cause a lot of stress for me, because I'm not having my need met, and I'm also having all these negative comments running in my head in regards to being incompetent and having to depend on other people. So what happens next is that I'm going to adopt a specific coping style to help me deal with this situation and deal with the schema and deal with my unmet needs, which I can't see at all because I'm blinded by my schema. So if I choose to, choosing in that case is not really a right description, because normally we don't choose, it happens automatically. That's the whole problem. That's the whole thing with our schemas, that it all becomes unconscious after a while, especially because the schemas develop in childhood. So we start to behave automatically. So anyway, at that point, in order to deal with stress, I'm going to adopt a specific coping response, which I've learned through years to help me cope with stressful situations regarding this particular schema. So regarding my incompetence, I feel that I'm incompetent, that generates stress, and I have to respond to that stress. So if I'm going to surrender to the schema, I'm going to do everything to prove that the schema is right. So I'm incompetent, I'm not autonomous, I depend on other people. So I'm going to put myself in situations where my incompetence is going to be reinforced. For example, I might have unrealistic standards that put me in situations which I don't fit in. They're too difficult, at least at this point of my development. Or I might simply sabotage myself when doing specific type of work or doing learning, so that I can reinforce the belief, so that this belief is basically actualized through actions and through my experiences. So that what happens when we surrender to our schema. If I start to avoid the schema altogether, I'm going to avoid all the situations that could trigger the schema. So I might, for example, avoid gaining new experiences because it's going to trigger my incompetence, right? If I put myself in a situation where I'm at first incompetent in what I'm doing because I have to learn, that's going to trigger my schema. So I'm not going to go into that situations. I'm going to probably avoid people who challenge me. I'm going to avoid people who are perceived to be more intelligent than me. And I'm not going to pursue any goals either, because that's going to trigger my schema. Because when we start with something, we're going to be incompetent for a while because we are learning. That's basically what happens when a person adopts, or when we adopt the avoidance of the schema. The last response I can adopt in that case would be to overcompensate. So I'm going to constantly challenge myself. I'm going to do everything to prove to everyone else that I'm very independent and that I can take care of my needs and I don't really need other people. And basically go into completely extreme ways of proving to the world and to myself that I'm competent. So when we look at this whole cycle of our experience in a way and how we reinforce this behavior, we can see that basically our coping style will reinforce the schema. And the schema is going to reinforce our stress, and therefore will reinforce the coping style that we adopt. And there are a few other things that it might be worth mentioning, which I haven't mentioned in previous videos. Coping styles are closely related to so-called modes, which are more permanent ways of dealing with schemas. And I'm not going to go too much into that because it's going to take too much time and I'd like to move on to other subjects. So how do we break off this cycle? Well, the reason why I've done these videos in the order that you can see is because I think, first of all, it would be mostly practical to take a look at our coping style and what we do with stress. How do we react to stressful situations? How do we react to things that are uncomfortable to us? Do we avoid them? Do we try to overcompensate? Do we basically surrender to whatever happens to us? If we start observing how we cope with stress on a regular basis, how we cope with anxiety, how we cope with whatever is uncomfortable to us, be it our emotions or other people, that's going to give us an idea on how we respond to our schemas as well. Now, the next step would be to observe how we behave on a regular basis. So, are there any patterns? Are there any repetitive experiences that we are having in our lives? Usually, schemas repeat themselves. So we basically repeat our behaviors, we repeat our emotions, we repeat our relationships, we repeat how we react to various circumstances that we find ourselves in. So being able to see these patterns is I think it's crucial to understanding what sort of schemas are influencing us and to what extent. Because I think that we all have the schemas, but the key is what we do with them and to what extent they influence us. Someone might have a schema of, to use the same example, dependence and incompetence, but it doesn't gonna influence them to such an extent that they will ruin their life and put themselves in situations where they can't express their autonomy or they can't express their competence. So I would imagine the whole process takes a lot of skill to be able to observe ourselves in this non-judgmental way, so that we can basically break the attachment that we are having to our schemas and to our coping styles. Because normally when we are under the influence of the schema, we're not gonna see truly what's going on. We're gonna see just the schema. So in order to break this attachment that we are having, we need to be able to take a step back and observe, what am I doing in this situation? What's going on? Where did I come from? Where am I going with this whole behavior, with this whole experience or the situation? What sort of emotions does it trigger in me? Is it pleasant? Is it something that I'd rather avoid? Or is it something that I agree with? So being able to kind of step back and observe what's going on to us, what's going on inside us and around us, will provide us with this more detached way of being able to observe ourselves. And as a result of that, we might be able to spot different patterns that are repeating themselves throughout our lives. I think only once we are able to understand our coping style and understand that there might be some schemas. I mean, at this point, I don't expect you to know every single schema that you might be having, because it might take quite a while to understand the whole process. But maybe you can't even name the schema, which is fine. You don't have to do it either. Schemas, or the names for the schemas, are just the names and the labels helping the psychologist to determine what's going on. So you might name them completely differently, but the point is to see the patterns, see what are your motivations, see what your intentions are in particular situations. And you can only do it by being able to take a step back and observe yourself in the present moment, by also taking into consideration your past and see if there's any relevance, and your future. So basically, where is your behavior taking you? What sort of future you're going to be having if you're going to continue on this path? Only once you are able to be able to see these patterns and to see how you respond to different situations, only then I would advise you to actually take a look at your needs. Now, the reason why I would advise you to look at your needs as the last point, or as the last stage of doing this work, is because if you have a strong schema, you're not going to see your needs, you're going to see the schema. And that's the purpose of the schema, to hide the need, to tell you in a way that if you take care of the schema, you don't have to take care of the need, which is not true. That's the trick that the schema wants you to believe in. Obviously, in the metaphorical sense, that the schema can't talk to you. So only at this point, it would be worth to investigate what your needs are, what sort of needs are going unmet, and how you go about meeting this particular needs. That's going to reinforce your understanding of the schemas that you are having and the coping styles that you might be using in regards to that particular schemas. And lastly, the most practical steps that that might help you with this whole process is probably journaling. So I've done it with some of my clients. I basically ask them to have a feeling journal. So basically, when you have an emotional reaction during the day, note it down, write it down. How does it feel? Where does this feeling come from? Why do you feel that way? What triggered it? And what do you do about it? For example, to use the same example as before with the dependence schema and lack of competence or belief in that, actually, I might have a repetitive feeling of feeling embarrassed in certain situations. So once you start to compose this journal, you start to see a pattern that in certain situations you feel embarrassed or ashamed. And once you are able to notice these situations and which particular triggers are giving you this experience, that's going to provide you with a lot of information what schemas are actually operating. So feeling journal is one thing. For some people, it might be difficult if their coping style is very strong or if their coping style is about avoidance. So they might not be able to notice their feelings, or they might not be able to understand where they're coming from and how to deal with them. So at that point, if such thing is happening, probably the best way is to deal with the coping style first. So things to look out for in that case would be are your reactions too extreme? What is it that you are avoiding, for example? What is it that you are surrendering to? And why did you choose this particular coping style? What can you gain from it? Where does it lead you, basically? So journaling would be the first thing that could help you with observing these patterns, because schemas have a way of twisting your memory in a way because they provide you with this specific lens as to how to observe yourself, how to observe your behaviors. So in order to get out of that lens and take a different point of view, you need to have some evidence of what has happened in this objective manner that might not be possible if you simply relied on your memory. When you start putting things on paper, for example, you start to have evidence of what happened and what your experience was like at that moment, so that at later stage, when you start to seek for patterns, you're going to see this evidence rather than relying on your memory, which might be kind of saturated by your schemas. And the final tip that could help you to take these practical steps to in a way increase your self-awareness and authenticity and get you outside of the patterns that you are operating in would be simply to practice mindfulness. Could be meditation, could be something called anchoring, which is from cognitive behavioral therapy. Basically, try to find what works for you and that gets you in the present moment. It might be, as I said, it might be meditation, focusing on your breath, focusing on the music, focusing on your sensations in your body, anything that you can find on the internet probably, or you can contact me for an advice if you like, because everyone is different and different things work for different people. So anything that allows you to be in the present moment. Now, the reason why I advise it is because you need to be able to develop very strong self-awareness or skills of self-observation. So for example, when you get into a situation where your schema gets triggered, you're not getting pulled into this crazy tunnel of your schema, but you're going to be able to take a step back and, collect yourself and be in a moment so that you can observe the whole experience from this more distant perspective. Whereas if you're unable to stay in this present moment, you're going to go pulled in and get attached to whatever your mind shows you, which is quite difficult to, which is not very useful to any sort of personal development work, any sort of therapeutic work, because you can't see what's going on. So that would be my final tip. If you have any comments or any ideas or perhaps any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below the video, perhaps send me a private message. And as I said before, this was the last video on this series on schema therapy, because I'd like to move to other subjects, and I'm sure that some of you might also want to explore these different subjects in psychology as well. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.